book, Seven from Haven, which are rather ambiguous stories. They might be ghost stories, they may not be. But the thing is, they are gentle and quizzical. And the story I'm going to read is called Mr. Eastman's Empathy.
Hello.
Good morning.
Hello.
As we promised.
Yes. I'm going to read from my book, Seven from Haven, which may or may not be ghost stories, but they're very gentle, ambiguous stories that may or may not be paranormal, may or may not be ghostly. And the story I'm reading is called Mr. Eastman's Empathy. Coffee, black. I automatically responded when the cook's booming voice called out through the kitchen pickup window to ask me what I was drinking. It was a small, dingy, wooden-looking luncheonette straight out of the 1950s in a small, sleepy village in the middle of nowhere. Because it was well past the lunch hour, the waitresses and patrons were long gone. Only the cook and I were there. Ordinarily, one quick glance at the interior of that nameless and unappetizing-looking greasy spoon, and I'd immediately turned around and walked out, except I was exhausted from driving and desperately needed to take a leak. As soon as I ordered coffee, I made a beeline for the men's room. When I returned a few minutes later, a large steaming mug was sitting on the counter. Beside it was a slice of blueberry pie, with a generous dollop of what appeared to be hand-whipped cream on top. "The pie's on the house," the still unseen cook announced from the kitchen. "The blueberry crop just came in yesterday, and Janice Fiedler baked a dozen of her yummy pies for us this morning. That's the last piece left. You'll love it." "Thanks," I replied, surprised and pleased at the cook's unsolicited generosity. "Don't mind if I do." I sat down on the round chrome and red vinyl stool, poured a sweet and low packet into the coffee, and tentatively took a sip. It was hot and rich and very, very tasty, infinitely superior to the designer brews and blends they serve at Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts. And my first bite of Janice Fiedler's blueberry pie convinced me that I had somehow stumbled into culinary heaven, sweet and tart at the same time, with a buttery, flaky crust that melted in my mouth. "Great, ain't it?" the cook asked, as he came through the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the dining room. "She's won the blue ribbon for her pies at Haven Harvest Festival 3 years running. Last month it was strawberries, next month peaches, and once we hit Labor Day, then I mean to tell you, we got some serious apple pies." I muttered something non-committal and inconsequential, much more intent on shoveling the fast-dwindling pie into my mouth and washing it down with more of that superb coffee. I'm embarrassed to admit I barely looked up until the last crumbs of that wonderful blueberry pie had disappeared. "More Java?" the cook asked. "It's my own brew." Looming in front of me was a huge hulk of a man who, at first glance, was every mother's nightmare, and for a brief instant frightened me too. Probably in his early 30s, his heavy beard couldn't disguise the fact that his face looked as though it had been pressed flat with a sledgehammer. An ex-boxer, perhaps, from the look of a mangled and mutilated ear, squashed nose, and a variety of scars crisscrossing his cheeks, chin, and forehead. His huge, hairy right hand dwarfed the coffee carafe handle. On each knuckle was the faint outline of a crude, self-inflicted tattoo letters that spelled L-O-V-E. Though he couldn't see it, I imagined that the four fingers of the left hand spelled out H-A-T-E. Apparently, one day he had come to his senses and tried to have them surgically removed. It had almost worked. He wore a long-sleeved, stiff-starched white shirt with cuffs turned up and what might have been earlier that morning a clean white apron. He also had on a New York Yankees baseball cap, covering either a very short crew cut or shaved head. The cook filled my nearly empty cup to the brim without waiting for me to answer. Can't stand them commercial coffee bags. I mixed together Kenyan, Jamaican, and Colombia beans, a tad of chicory, a couple of chocolate beans, a pinch of salt, and my secret ingredient. I'd tell you what it is, he said impishly, then I'd have to kill you. That broke the ice as he and I smiled at each other. He put the carafe down, wiped his hand on the stained apron, and held it out to me. Pete Molyneux. It's French originally. I own this here place. Well, me and the bank, that is. I took the proffered hand and shook it, expecting to have mine enveloped and crushed in a macho squeeze. Instead, his grip was surprisingly gentle. Mark Santori, I replied, originally from Boston, now Brooklyn. What brings you to Haven? Passing through. Whether it was the coffee or the pie or Pete's infectious friendliness, I suddenly felt like talking. I install and troubleshoot Unix servers. Silence. Okay, I really didn't expect a short-order cook in an out-of-the-way village to know anything about high-end computer nodes and networks and thin clients. So I simply explained, computers. I was at the Corning Glass in Ithaca on a service call. It wasn't necessary to state the obvious, that I was on the interstate headed home when I needed to stop. And this town was only a couple miles south of the next exit, and his restaurant was the first one I saw. Haven's a sweet, caring village, Pete declared. That's twice within 30 seconds that he had ascended his stereotype. I hadn't expected such rough character to use adjectives like sweet and caring, or for that matter, to describe his pies as yummy. It looks after its own. Yeah, I noticed. I glanced across the street at the spiffy, shiny new ambulance parked in front of a large, almost completed garage. I see it's rich enough to afford a new rig. Nice looking. Must have cost a mint. I knew something about ambulances because last year I'd worked almost a month in an EMS dispatch office in Bridgeport, Connecticut, upgrading its countywide emergency response computer system. It was donated, Pete replied. That and the ambulance building and a Jaws of Life outfit for the fire company. A gift from Mr. Ronald Eastman. Eastman, as in Kodak. Don't know about that, Mark, he replied with an easy, friendly familiarity. But I mean to tell you, Mr. Eastman is the most unselfish, givingest man I have ever known. Practically the whole village turned out for his funeral. How did he die? I asked, not particularly interested in hearing the details of the passing of a rich old geezer, but wanting to keep the conversation going because I was enjoying Pete's company and my second cup of coffee. Besides, there was nothing of any urgency waiting for me at home. Of empathy, Pete said solemnly. Empathy. I hadn't a clue what he meant by that. I involuntarily arched my eyebrows, not so much in disbelief as puzzlement. Well, it's a long story, Pete said. He paused to think, stuck his large index finger in the air, as if to say, wait a minute. He then poured himself a cup of coffee, walked around to the front of the counter, and sat on the stool next to me. Once settled, Pete began a rambling, pre-reeling narrative about the death and life of the remarkable Mr. Ronald Eastman, late of the village of Haven, Pennsylvania. I gathered that Eastman had been a successful high-tech yuppie type from King of Prussia, Philadelphia's Silicon Valley, who had made a large fortune when he took his company public, cashed in on just before the dot-com meltdown, and then retired to the Pocono Mountains. His predominant passion in life was golf, so he actually went and bought himself a golf course. That would be the Cold Valley Country Club, which Pete said is a mile or two south of Haven, and then built a magnificent mansion for himself that fronted on the fairway. He and his good friend Glenn, Pete didn't out and out say they were gay, only that Glenn was Mr. Eastman's living companion, played a round of golf almost every day from spring through autumn, weather permitting, of course. For the first 3 years, Mr. Eastman and Glenn lived there, Pete recounted. They had nothing to do with nobody in town. They didn't even hire nobody because they had their own help from Philadelphia, an old husband and wife, to do the cooking, cleaning, shopping, and anything else the big house needed. Everything changed one October morning when Glenn collapsed on the 11th hole, a heart attack. Mr. Eastman frantically punched 911 on his cell phone, pleading for an ambulance and someone who could perform CPR, but nobody was around during the daytime to crew Haven's ambulance. That's just the way it is with the volunteer-staffed ambulance association. So the emergency call had to be mutuated, passed on, first to Black Bear, then Promised Land, then Newfoundland, and finally to Gouldsboro. It took nearly 45 minutes for Gouldsboro's ambulance to arrive on scene. Glenn died in Mr. Eastman's arms, he said, sadly, even though he probably had never known the victim personally. I couldn't imagine this gentle giant with a train wreck of a face traveling in the same social circles. The guys on the crew said Mr. Eastman wept and wailed like a baby. In the end, they had to trank him and take him to the hospital for emotional trauma. Sad to say, my friend, almost nobody from Haven showed up for Glenn's funeral. A few local golf buddies, the housekeeper and her husband, a handful of employees from the country club, the contractor who built Mr. Eastman's house, and Karen Dobson, who goes to almost every funeral, whether she knows the folks or not. That's all there was from hereabouts. When he got up to give the eulogy in the almost empty church, Mr. Eastman made a solemn vow before God that he would give his life to help others get emergency medical assistance in Haven. That's when he got involved big time with the Haven Ambulance Association. Pete paused to drain his coffee mug, wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He simply showed up at the firehouse one Wednesday evening. Back then, the association shared the building with the Haven Volunteer Fire Department. Wednesdays when the members meet regular like, to practice their skills, clean the rig, replenish the supplies, that sort of thing. He asked to join the association on the spot, but then told them that he first had to take the emergency responder course. Unfortunately, because nobody around here was much interested, they weren't going to have no class until January. Mr. Eastman, he said he couldn't wait more than 3 months. So he asked Kenny Penderton, he was the association captain back then, how they could get an ER course going right away. Kenny told him they need at least 10 people before the county Red Cross chapter would hold a class. Well, Mark, the long and short of it was, it took only a couple weeks to line everything up. Mr. Eastman paid out of his own pocket for 8 employees from his country club to take the ER course. With him and Tom, his houseman, that made 10. So they went ahead and held the course at the firehouse 3 nights a week for 2 months. By Christmas, the Haven Ambulance Association had 10 brand new state-certified emergency responders. That's more volunteers than they got in 4 or 5 years total. Mr. Eastman, he also wrote out a check for a new transmission when Donnie Walker chewed up the gears trying to get Haven's old ambulance unstuck from the snowbank. What happened next, I asked, as Pete poured me a 3rd cup of coffee. Well, Mr. Eastman, he came out every time the ambulance was toned. That's what they call it when the beeper goes off, whether it was his shift or not. He dropped whatever he was doing, jumped into his red Porsche, turned on his flashing blue emergency light, and raced for the firehouse building. But you know what an emergency responder is, don't you? A gopher. The guy who gets the stretcher and the bandages and the backboard and stuff. An emergency responder some of the times takes the patient's pulse, tapes up a wound, cleans up the vomit on the floor of the rig. Oh yeah, he also handles all the paperwork, name, address, medical history, that kind of stuff. Usually Mr. Eastman was the first person at the building when there was a call, so he'd start up the old rig, drive it out of the building, move over to the passenger seat, and wait for an EMT and his driver to show up. Without an EMT on board, state law says you got to mutual aid to another company, even if it's a life or death call. Since I refrained from interrupting with questions or comments, Pete continued his narrative. Sometime in March or April, about 3 years back, they got toned for Emily Hawkins' 15-month-old. Sorry, it's been so long, the story's made the rounds so many times, I can't recall the baby's name. Come to think of it, I don't even know or sure whether it was a he or a she. The kid swallowed a toy and was choking. Mr. Eastman made a quick beeline for the ambulance, pulled the rig out, and waited. For driver showed up a couple minutes later, but there weren't no EMT around that day. So much as they hated to do it, they mutually called it Tafton. And just like Mr. Eastman's companion Glenn, Emily Hawkins' kid dies before the ambulance arrives on scene. Bummer, I commented. It wasn't the most sympathetic or diplomatic thing I could have said, but not knowing any of these people personally, I couldn't really feel emotional for a nameless child who had died years earlier. Mr. Eastman, well, I mean to tell you, he was quite truly devastated, so he made another vow that there would never be no emergency that the Haven Ambulance Association couldn't and wouldn't respond to. The very next day, he went to Kenny and asked how much money he made on his regular job at the Hamlin Auto Center as a tire installer. Kenny told him, and Mr. Eastman promised to pay him double if he'd work for him at the country club. Told him it didn't matter none what he did, handyman, groundskeeper, busboy, whatever, so long as Kenny was always around to take ambulance calls, just to make sure that they were never without an EMT, even when Kenny was sick or had a weekend off. Mr. Eastman also hired Carol Thomas, one of the other EMTs, as a waitress. Eventually, all but one of Haven's EMTs worked at the country club, at top wages too, Pete added, with a degree of admiration in his voice. Next thing Mr. Eastman did was to become an EMT himself. He took the full 125-hour course. That's every Monday, Wednesday, Friday evening for 5 months, and passed with flying colors. Most commendable, I said, and I meant it. Here was a man who put himself out to help others. I began to feel a little ashamed that I had never even bothered to donate blood to the Red Cross. Yeah, Pete responded, slowly shaking his head. But it's sad to say, Mark, that's what killed him in the end. How so? I asked. Figure that maybe he got hit by a car besides the highway, or died of a coronary helping lift a fat patient, or accidentally got infected with AIDS or some other fatal virus. The only way we can explain it is he died of empathy. Empathy? I still had no idea what Pete was trying to say. Yeah, empathy. That's the word Bob Krause used, and it kind of stuck. Pete poured himself another cup of coffee and would have refilled mine if I hadn't put my hand over the rim. I had finally reached my limit. It all started on his first emergency call as a full-fledged EMT. A 13-year-old girl was riding. Her horse stumbled and rolled over at Pocono Pines. That's a big summer camp halfway between Haven and Lake in the Clouds. One of the counselors tried lifting her up. It's about the worst thing you can do with a neck or back injury. Suddenly, she had no feeling below her neck, couldn't move nothing. You know, like the guy who played Superman. What's his name? Christopher Reed, I interjected. Yeah, Christopher Reed. Well, Mark, they called out the ambulance, and in 10 minutes, Mr. Eastman was on scene. Now, there's not an awful lot you can do for a spinal or neck injury victim, except collar him and strap him down on a stiff wooden backboard. But Mr. Eastman, he takes one look at this poor little girl, still wearing her black felt riding cap, tears rolling down her cheeks, and it breaks his heart. So he lays his hands on the back of her neck on a big bump where the bone broke and popped out of place. Some swear there was a bright strobe-like light pulsing from his hands as he held her, but others said that they didn't see nothing. Well, I mean to tell you, the man upstairs must have been there that morning, because before you know it, the little girl begins wiggling her hands and toes like there was nothing wrong. She tells everybody that she can feel her arms and legs again. Of course, they took her to the hospital and x-rayed her neck. You know what they found? No, what did it show? I asked, convinced I knew what the punchline was going to be. It would show no injury whatever. I've read about the so-called miracle and spontaneous cures, like most doctors, scientists, and rational non-believers. I was convinced such injuries and illnesses were either faked, of a minor nature, or psychosomatic to begin with. In my book, faith healing had about as much credibility factor as the existence of UFOs, vampires, and werewolves. Well, then their x-rays show that this little girl had broken her neck clean through, severing the spinal cord. But a miracle happened. It instantly knitted back together on its own. Now that's a fact, Mark, and if you don't believe me, well, you can look it up in the Wayne County Eagle. They wrote it up on the front page, even had a photo of the girl with her parents. I was very skeptical, just said nothing. Mr. Eastman, well, he said he was never the same afterward. When they wheeled the little girl into the emergency room, Mr. Eastman, no sooner than said goodbye and good luck, he always wished his patients good luck, then he collapsed onto the hospital floor. They sent him up to X-ray. You know what they found? 2 herniated discs and then calcium deposits on his back. Bad back's fairly common in elderly people. And no, Mark, Pete interrupted, his modulating voice betraying a rising excitement. It weren't that, because Mr. Eastman had a thorough physical just a couple weeks earlier, and he sure didn't have no arthritis or slipped discs. Don't go thinking he was some old out-of-shape fuddy-duddy. Back then, Mr. Eastman probably could have lifted me over his head without even working up a sweat. He was tall, athletic, worked out every day. Though after Glenn died, he never played golf again. He looked more like a movie star than, I don't know, retired gazillionaire. Besides, he was a young guy, only 44 years old. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to know where Pete's story was